Canada is a land that was built by immigrants. And it would not be the land it is today without these immigrants. But it is important to remember who this country originally belonged to. It was taken away and was stripped away from Indigenous people. It is incredible how Indigenous people are treated so poorly by the government, the criminal justice system, police officers, and there are certain stereotypes that people believe that they fall in. There's a crisis happening. Indigenous people are overrepresented in prisons, and their women and girls are going missing and murdered every day. Let's take a look back at their history. The colonization and the trauma of Indigenous people resulted in them being victimized and being sanctioned to violence. The land of Indigenous people were taken. Once their land was taken, invading colonists continued to exploit Indigenous people politically, economically, and socially. The colonization of Indigenous people also brought about oppressive policies and genocidal initiatives. Indigenous children are forced to go to residential schools, and in those residential schools they face sexual and physical violence. Residential schools were created to assimilate Indigenous children into the white culture, and to leave the Indigenous culture behind. If they were seen speaking their Indigenous language, they would be punished. The violence and oppression that Indigenous faced during the colonization still affects them in the present day. They are still victimized and oppressed. Consequences of forced assimilation are being passed down generation to generation. These individuals who have had their culture destroyed now have nothing to pass down to their children. They are estranged from their own culture, and now so are their children. The mental and physical abuse endured by Aboriginal children in the residential school system has left them suffering from trauma that they experienced. Aboriginal people are of low social, economic, and political status and are constantly the victims of racism and discrimination. Because of their low socio-economic statuses, they tend to experience lower life expectancy, high rates of morbidity, chronic disease, suicide, injury, and mortality at a much more accelerated rate than the rest of the Canadian population. Most of these are consequences of economic inequalities faced by the Indigenous communities. Now let's take a look at our prison system. In Canada, Indigenous people only make up 4% of the population, which is not very much. However, in institutions, they make up over 20%. How is that even possible? The crime rate in Canada has gone down, but the incarceration rates have only gone up. Especially for women, it has gone up 112%. In Canada, the Indigenous incarceration rate is 10 times higher than the non-Indigenous population. Aboriginal females accounted for 38% of female admissions to provincial and territorial sentence custody. In the federal correctional services, they accounted for 31%. Aboriginal males accounted for 26% of males' admissions to provincial and territorial sentence custody. And in the federal correctional services, they accounted for 23%. Additionally, Indigenous inmates are sentenced to longer terms and spend more time in segregation and maximum security. They are less likely to be granted parole and are more likely to have parole revoked for minor problems. Young Indigenous youth are also overrepresented in the criminal justice system. Even though Indigenous youth only make up 6% of the youth population in Canada, they make up over 30% of youth in Canada. Indigenous youth are 8 times more likely to end up in prison compared to white youth. Indigenous youth are also most likely to receive longer and harsher sentences regardless of criminal history and the severity of the crimes compared to non-Indigenous youth. Indigenous youth are overrepresented in prisons, but perhaps one of the biggest reasons of the overrepresentation of youth has to do with colonization. There is a gross overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system. Even with Gladue courts, there continues to be a rise of Indigenous people in institutions. One of the main arguments is why there's such a big overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prisons is because of colonization, and how the independency of Indigenous people declined after colonization. Another argument is due to limited resources and resource distribution. This creates a community that has huge disadvantages, and youth end up with little opportunities. Indigenous people have had their land and rights stripped away from them. There was a cultural genocide that happened. There was never any healing done to help Indigenous people overcome the trauma that they have faced due to colonization. The combination of poor living conditions, poverty, social and economic deprivation of Indigenous people is no wonder why Indigenous people are overrepresented in prisons. Due to the fact that Indigenous people did not have any sort of treatment after the colonization, Indigenous people most likely grew up in a dysfunctional family where childhood abuse took place. Growing up in a dysfunctional family can lead a child or youth to the feeling of being rejected and make them angry, which can lead to criminal behavior. Since there are no steps in treating the trauma that Indigenous people faced during colonization, the anger of Indigenous people and their way of dealing with the trauma include drinking and taking their anger out on others, which could include their spouse and children. The children learn this behavior and they end up doing it to their own children. The cycle will never end. Victoria Crow Shoe, Gloria Gladue, Brooklyn Moose, Dolores Brown, Crystal Andrews, Misty Potts, Kathleen Leary, Teresa Robinson, Beatrice Adam, Angela Poorman, Pamela Napoleon, Tina Fontaine, Shayan Fox, Rachel Bear, Samantha Paul, Destiny Tom, Leah Anderson, Shelley Dean. These are just a few names of Indigenous women who have gone murdered or missing, and some of their cases are still unresolved. There have been over 1,000 Indigenous women and girls who have either been missing or have gone murdered in Canada. Over 1,000. And the government does not acknowledge this as a crisis. The government chooses to ignore this. It is so common for Indigenous women and girls to go missing, and yet most of Canada are probably not even aware of this crisis. It is barely covered in the media. The government does not want to talk about it. Police officers ignore it. And unfortunately in Canada, it's just not considered important. When Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, he did not acknowledge that there was a specific target on Indigenous women. He simply ignored it and said there was an overall crime problem. See, that is the problem. When something is ignored, it will continue to occur until someone starts talking about the problem and they start bringing awareness. Indigenous women are vulnerable. They are unfortunately an easy target because people do not care if something happens. The government doesn't care, police officers do not care, and the media does not care. If anything, the blame is put on the Indigenous women. They wanted it. They asked for it. They're in this problem for a reason. When will it stop? Indigenous women are more likely than non-Indigenous women to be victimized. In a study conducted, Indigenous women were 3 times more likely to be victimized than non-Indigenous women. Indigenous women are more likely to be victimized by strangers, acquaintances, and by their parents, and by their partners, than non-Indigenous women. Women are already seen as inferior than men, but Indigenous women are seen more inferior than white women. There is already the stereotype of an Indigenous woman that they always want it, that they're asking for it, that they're seen as a sexy Indian girl. With these types of stereotypes in place, it is not hard to understand why Indigenous women are more likely to be victimized. People feel as though they can take advantage of Indigenous women because no one really cares what happens to them. This is a problem not only in Canada, but also in the United States. 70% of violent victimization that Indigenous women face were done by someone of a different ethnic group. Indigenous women and girls are afraid to ask police officers for help because there is no trust between them. police officers don't care. Indigenous women have been victimized by police officers, and so they feel that if they ask for help, they won't actually do anything. And they have reason to believe this because of the past history. Indigenous women are targets of violence. People believe that they can do anything to them and get away with it. The government, police officers, communities do not speak up for Indigenous women. They do not offer them protection. Our silence is killing them. Indigenous women will continue to go missing and murdered if the public does not speak up against this issue. How did Indigenous women become such a big target for victimization and racialization? The colonization of Indigenous people plays a big role in why Indigenous women are victimized. Indigenous women played a big role in the community, but with the colonization, their role started to diminish, as they had to adapt to the dominant culture's view of women. Women were seen as inferior. The men who colonized did not want to speak to women who were in charge because they believed that they were not worthy of discussing terms with. Women were belittled. They were sexually and physically abused during the colonization. Until this day, they are still sexually and physically abused. It can be argued that there's a genocide happening right before our eyes, and we either choose not to see it or we want it to happen. Since the colonization, Indigenous people have suffered. Their land was stripped, their culture taken away, abuse in the forms of sexual, physical, and emotional. They are overrepresented in prison. Their women and girls are missing and murdered. We are in the year 2017, and nothing has been done to help protect Indigenous people. Nothing has been done to help resolve the crisis that is going on. There is no justice for Indigenous people. There's honestly so much more to be learned about the racialization of Indigenous people. We have just touched on it right now. Take a couple of minutes and reflect on what is going on. Why is this problem still occurring? What can be done? How can I help? One voice can make a difference. And if all our voices unite, we can bring justice for Indigenous people. We can help them out.